The only sound of the awkward car ride was the subtle tapping of the rain on the windshield. It was clear that my mother and stepfather had been fighting all morning. The recent passing of my stepfather's dad had been the subject of many heated conversations this week. Randy, my stepfather, hardly ever mentioned him. He didn't like to talk about his childhood. Ultimately, my mom and I agreed to attend his funeral for the sake of appearances. Summer break was almost over. The idea of wasting the last week of freedom before school to attend a funeral for someone you don't really know was brutal, but I had no other choice. Sam, my younger stepbrother, was in middle school and rather quiet for a kid. I think I scared him, although he and Roger had lived with us for almost a year. But for me, being a senior this year and off to college the next was weighing on my mind. What little free time I would have would be such a rare commodity. I dreaded the idea of driving for so long with my family, but thankfully I was preoccupied with my phone for the majority of the ride. That is until around the 5-hour mark of the car ride, when we lost cellular data. I glanced outside and was unfamiliar with the landscape that surrounded us. Thick trees and heavy clouds, as far as the eye could see. It was as if this place was untouchable by the seasons, perfectly encapsulated in its own private enclosure, safe from the rest of the world. It didn't take us long to finally reach our destination as Roger pulled off into a gravel road. A large wooden sign set at the front of the trees, much like you'd see with new neighborhoods, inviting new people to move in. An ideal-looking family, if such a thing existed, was painted in the 1950s style of art, all waving at the viewer, but it had since faded. There were words painted on the bottom of the sign, but they were illegible due to the aging of the board. My mother turned to me and smiled softly, reassuring me that this would be a quick trip, although her eyes clearly told me to keep my complaints to a minimum. I anticipated for us to reach a church or someplace that they'd be holding a funeral at soon, but the gravel road seemed to stretch on. Even my mother gave Roger a look, as if she too was confused. He noticed her glance and gave us a rather odd advice. These people are rather peculiar. I wouldn't bother talking to any of them. What strange advice, I thought. We finally arrived in a large clearing surrounded by trees. Several small homes laid scattered about uniformly, but in a way that told me that these were either very old or built by someone with inexperience. We pulled up to one of the small homes and hopped out of the car. As we were stretching and unloading the car, a man a few years older than Roger exited the home. The resemblance was surprising. It was clear that this was Roger's brother. The two embraced sheepishly. Clearly there was a history between the two that they were having to put aside for the funeral. The man welcomed us in, and we followed him inside as we carried our bags. He seemed nice, but I didn't catch his name. We followed Roger, who guided us to one of the two rooms of the backside of the house. Sam and I put our stuff in one of the other rooms. The home had the bare minimum furniture and had very little design. What little artwork you could see reminded me of stock footage you would find in a picture frame when you bought it. I unpacked my bag and checked my phone for service, only to see it still had no access to data. I was frustrated, but not surprised. My mom entered the room not much later. She smiled and whispered to me that Sam and I would have to stay here, while she and Roger went to the funeral with his brother. I was tempted to attend, seeing how I would be bored out of my mind here, but something about this place made me want to leave. Before I could answer, Sam spoke up. "We can stay here," he said quickly. I was surprised but relieved that he said something. I glanced at him. His expression was that of certainty and concern. My mom nodded and smiled. "All right, you two keep an eye on each other and we'll be back when we can," my mom said as she glanced down at her watch. "I'm not sure how long these things go for, but I can't imagine it'll be long." She left the room, and I could hear her, Roger, and the brother leave the house. An eerie silence hung in the air before Sam spoke up. "This isn't a good place," he whispered, as if he feared that someone would overhear him. A chill slowly crawled down my spine just the way he said it, sparking a brief moment of curiosity in me. "What do you mean by that, Sam?" He looked down, as if he was ashamed he said anything at all. "It's good that we stayed back. Grandpa wasn't nice," he muttered. I sat on the bed facing him. "I'm sorry, buddy." A moment passed where we briefly connected. Seeing how there was nothing to do and that we were both tired, we spent a good portion of the afternoon napping on the two separate beds. The drive must have taken more out of us than we realized. When I finally woke up, it was dark outside. I checked my phone for the time and saw that it was 7 o'clock. Still no service on my phone. Sam was still sleeping in the bed when I got up. I left the room while wiping the sleep from my eyes. I could feel my stomach rumble as I was pretty hungry. I bobbed my head over into the room where my parents put their stuff, but they weren't there. I checked the living room, but it was dark. I found the light switch and turned the lights on, only to find the living room was empty. A quick tentative inspection of the house revealed that my parents weren't here. I wasn't terribly concerned with finding them, as finding food was my main priority. I wandered over to the kitchen and looked for something to hold me over, preferably something small that Roger's brother wouldn't notice missing. I checked the pantry and saw that there were many unopened packages for ingredients, but not actual food. I checked the fridge and saw that it was empty. I was frustrated. It was like whoever lived here needed to stock up on more food, or that they didn't even live here at all. I walked through the house, inspecting this rather strange home of Roger's brother. There was no television. The appliances were dated but looked unused for the most part. I stepped outside into the cool night air. The half-dozen homes were scattered in the clearing, dimly lit off in the distance. I made a futile attempt to call my mom, but it didn't work. A creeping suspicion began to grow in my mind. There was something off about this place. I went back inside and ventured to the room of our host, whose name I still didn't know. I felt anxious as I peered inside. I could hear Sam waking from his nap, and I walked over to talk to him. "Is my dad back yet?" he asked, slowly getting out of bed. "No, he's not. He's still out with my mom." "Do you know this place?" I asked, in hopes of understanding more. He seemed hesitant to answer, but eventually shook his head. "Do you know where they might have gone?" He looked behind and out the window and back at me. "We aren't allowed to go out at night." I got closer to him and put my hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Sam. You're with me." His eyes narrowed on me, as if he was unsure if he could trust me. "There's a church out in the woods by Grandma's house, but I don't like going there," he whimpered. "Oh, that's probably where they are. Can you show me where that is?" He shook his head almost immediately. "Come on, Sam, that's where they're gonna be." He took some persuasion but reluctantly agreed. We put our shoes on and went outside. I turned my flashlight on my phone, and Sam held my hand as he guided me towards the woods. We walked on the gravel road, our feet crunching on the small rocks. The houses off in the distance continued to shine as we ventured towards the dark woods. The gravel road led us to the woods, which continued inside. Sam's breathing became noticeable, causing me to slowly get anxious. "So, when was the last time you were here?" I asked, making small talk to lighten the mood. "My dad and I lived out here before we met your mom. I was born here." The last part of that statement caught me off guard. We continued walking into the woods until we saw a decently sized building. A few exterior floodlights were on, but no lights on from inside. The path led to the building, but there were no cars parked or a parking lot nearby. Off a ways to the left of the church was another small home with its lights on. I assumed this to be his late grandmother's house, "This the place?" I genuinely asked, seeing how this looked like a random building more than any church I've ever seen. Sam didn't answer, but kept walking. We approached one of the doors from outside. I expected it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door was open. I went inside, but Sam didn't follow. He stayed outside. I turned back confused. "Sam, you have to stay with me, dude. I'm not letting you out of my sight. I don't know this place like you do. I'll get lost." "There's bad stuff in there," he said. I paused in the hallway. I could tell by the look on his face that he was serious. Something bad had happened here, and by the looks of it, it was still fresh in his mind. I already felt bad for bringing him out here. I wasn't going to make him come back to what I could only assume to be a place where he was traumatized. "Okay, Sam, why don't I pop my head in here and you hang outside? I'll be quick." He nodded in agreement. I went further into the church and did my best to find a light switch, but I couldn't find one. The eeriness of the building was one thing, but the fact that it was in the middle of the woods at night was another. The floor was carpeted. The walls were chipped yellow paint. A smell of mold and neglect could faintly be detected. The exterior lights gave me the false impression that the building was occupied, but it was empty. I knew that my parents weren't here, but I would have ventured in further out of pure curiosity. However, I didn't want to leave Sam outside for long. I quickly abandoned my search inside the church and went back out to Sam. My worry for my mother was growing, but I felt Sam knew something about this place that he wasn't telling me. I met up with Sam and glanced off to the home down the trail. "Is that your grandpa's house?" I asked while pointing my light in that direction. Sam was silent, but I saw him nod his head in the corner of my eye. "Well, they're probably in there then." Sam responded and said that he was never allowed inside his grandpa's home. Another statement I thought to be weird. We walked over in the direction of the home. The gravel path connected from the church. The closer we got, the more I could see of this house. Only the main level of the home was lit, but unlike the other houses I saw here, this one had a second story. We approached the home and I stopped outside. I prepared mentally what I would say if I on the off chance ran into someone living here, but that quickly left my mind as I saw that the front door of the house was open. Light from inside the house came spilling out into the woods, and I could see that unlike the home that we were staying in, this one had actual stuff inside. I glanced over to Sam, and he held my hand while looking inside. I could tell that he was nervous, but just as curious as I was. I began walking inside, and Sam followed. The main level of the home was in disorder. Dirt and general debris was littering the floor. The furniture inside was torn and tossed on its sides. Old pictures hung on the walls, but unlike the stock photos from the other home, these all had people from a long time ago. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of unease. It was clear that our parents weren't here, but Sam and I couldn't help but look around. In the living room was an old fireplace that had a portrait of an old woman sitting in a chair. To the left of the portrait was an old shotgun mounted on a wooden frame. Stuffed ducks posing as if they were flying sat next to it. On the adjacent wall was a deer mount with a similar frame for a gun, but this one was empty. Towards the back of the home to the right was a staircase that led upstairs, but the lights on the second floor were off. At this point, Sam and I were making our way through the home when we both stopped in our tracks, when we heard something inside. The house was old, but the unmistakable sound of movement came from beneath the floors. We looked at each other and remained silent. I could hear the blood pulse in my head as I strained to hear the sound once more. Sam's expression told me that he heard it also, and was trying to listen for more. An unsettling silence hung in the air as we exchanged worried glances as the apparent sound of sobbing began to be heard. My blood froze. The muffled cries from below were audible for only a few moments before stopping. I wasn't sure, but they sounded different in nature. Our eyes widened. Someone else was here. My first instinct was to get out of here, to take Sam back to the place where we were staying and hope that her parents would be back there. But the thought then formed in my mind, what if this was my mom? Sam slowly began to motion towards the door. I put my hand up to signal to stop him. We listened for a few more seconds before the home was silent again. "We really need to go," Sam whispered. "What if that's my mom?" I replied. Sam just stared at me, unsure how to answer the question. I tiptoed over to the kitchen and looked around. The linoleum floor was smeared and had what looked like drag marks leading in a certain direction that I followed. Sure enough, the drag marks led to a door with a heavy padlock on it. My mind began to race. I was unsure of whoever was in the basement, but I knew that this was a bad situation. Before I could do anything, the sound of a car approaching on the gravel could be heard outside. Sam and I exchanged glances, and we ran back to the living room. Headlights from outside shined in as the car parked. I grabbed Sam's hand and we ran upstairs to the second level. We entered the first room that we came across and hid in one of the corners. We heard a car door open, and the footsteps on gravel head to the back of the car and open the trunk. The sound of labored breathing mixed with something heavy landing on the ground grew louder. Whoever was outside was now dragging something heavy in the home. We could hear the sounds of screaming coming from the basement as the person made their way inside. I tried to piece together what was going on, but my mind was racing to keep us alive. The dragging continued and made their way past the stairs and into the kitchen towards the locked door. I could now hear the sound of whoever was downstairs pull out a set of keys and unlock the basement door. The footsteps and dragging continued down the stairs. Now was the time to go. I motioned for Sam to follow me, and we quietly exited the dark room and peered down the stairs. From what I could see, the coast was clear. Whoever was inside could be heard down in the basement, shouting at whoever else was down there. I quickly made my way down the stairs, doing my best to be quiet. I made it to the main floor and noticed that a trail of dark liquid lined the pathway from the front door to the kitchen. A foul odor assaulted my senses. I focused on trying to calm my breathing as I moved from the stairs to the front door. I went outside past the running car and debated on taking it back to the house where we were staying when I looked back and saw that I was alone. I must have lost Sam somewhere in the house. Fear gripped me as I weighed my options. The dark woods looked inviting for once. I would be able to hide and let the darkness cover me, but then again, Sam was a child, my stepbrother. I hesitated. I knew that whatever was going on in the basement would certainly scar me, but I couldn't subject Sam to such a fate. Before I could even think, I was back inside. I whispered for Sam, but all I could focus on was the noise in the basement. I paused in the living room, my heart beating faster. I could feel my hands getting clammy as I walked over to the wall and grabbed the shotgun from the wooden mount. It was old and rusted. It had a satisfying weight to it. It reminded me of one of those you would see in a Western cartoon with two barrels, but I had no idea if it was loaded. I didn't even know how to use it. There was a good chance that this thing wasn't even real. Worst case scenario was I could use it as a threat if I ran into whoever was downstairs. I tried calling for Sam again, but no answer. I glanced over to the kitchen. The locked door hung open, the smeared liquid leading inside. Sam wouldn't be dumb enough to go down there, would he? The crying down the stairs intensified. I slowly made my way over, raising the gun up on my shoulders like I'd seen in the movies. The closer I got to the door, the more anxious my mind became. I knew deep down that I needed to go down there. Whether it was to check for Sam or even my mother, I had to know. I stood in front of the door and looked down the long stairway. A single light bulb illuminated at the bottom of the stairs. The anticipation petrified me. The crying covered my steps as I slowly creaked down the wooden stairs. The further down I went, the more I could see the unfinished basement. I could see a male figure straddling over what looked like a body bag, its contents writhing slowly inside. There was no sign of Sam, but I felt obligated to help the two people whom I assumed to be captured down here. The last few steps felt like a blur as my adrenaline kicked in. I raised the gun at the man and shouted, "Hey!" with the deepest voice I could muster. He stopped what he was doing and jumped. He was an older man. He looked just as scared as I was that I was even down here, let alone pointing a gun at him. He stepped away from the bag and lifted his hands. He tried to find his words as he stuttered. You don't know what you're doing, young lady." His cowardice and frailness caught me off guard. I was about to shout another command at the old man when a familiar voice cried out from the bag. "Taylor, it's me, please, get me out of here." My mom's voice cried from the bag. I could hear banging coming from the far side of the dark basement. Loud screeching echoed behind a door which rattled frantically. I don't know what unsettled me more, my mom's voice or the inhuman screams muffled behind the door. The gun shook in my hands. "Open the bag! Let her out!" I screamed. The man just stood there, shaking his head. He was questioning the situation but becoming more confident by each second. "I won't do that," he said, nervously. He eyed my gun while slowly lowering his hands. In an attempt to intimidate him, I thumbed back both hammers on the gun. Again, another move I've seen in the movies. "Open the bag," I said calmly. The man took a step forward. The bag on the ground flailed. My mom's voice pleaded for help from inside. "They're not what you think," the old man said, reaching behind his back and revealing a large knife. The man was calling my bluff. With all the commotion in the basement, I began to panic. A sound from behind me caught me off guard. Sam's voice screamed from behind me. "Taylor!" he cried. I glanced back and saw Sam extending his hand towards me, as if wanting me to stop what I was doing. I glanced back at the man and he tried to rush me. He had closed most of the gap, but the next thing I knew, a loud bang erupted in my hands. The gun went off. The gun kicked hard, nearly leaving my hands. The man spun around violently as his flesh ripped from his body. I had only clipped him, but the arm holding the knife was no longer on his body. Sam and I were both stunned. The man lay next to the bag. Shock had kicked in as he felt his right side and blood spurted from his missing limb. He tried to talk, but only gasps came out. I paused at the carnage that I just caused. I didn't want this. A brief sense of guilt washed over me as I processed what had just happened. That guilt quickly went away as I came back to the situation and heard my mother's voice crying again. I ran over to the bag and unzipped it. I wasn't sure what condition she was in. The blood trail assured me that she must have been bleeding, but I didn't expect what I saw next. A frightening sight waited for me. Out of shock, I jumped back. Whatever was inside was not only my mother, but was certainly not even human. A grotesque face greeted me. Its dark eyes assaulted my mind. Its hands immediately ripped open the rest of the bag as I staggered away. The man on the ground was now crying. This was what the man tried to warn me about. The thing stood up. revealing its horrific body. Scars covered its gray, hairless skin. Snaggled teeth filled its wide smile. I could see its torso had been bleeding from earlier, as dried stains covered its side. Before I could process more of this creature, it pounced with terrible speed on the poor man who I just shot. He cried as he reached for his knife, but was immediately intercepted. At first, all I could do was watch in horror, the creature slashing violently at the defenseless man. Blood began to pool around him as he squirmed in pain. Sam sprinted off into the darkness of the basement towards the banging of the door. My mind could hardly grasp the horror of the situation. What was this thing? How did it trick me like that? And why was Sam running to the dark portion of the basement towards the terrible screams? I stepped backwards as I remembered I held the gun in my hands. I aimed it at the creature as it continued its assault. I pulled the trigger, expecting another loud bang to fill the basement, but nothing. I looked at the gun and noticed that both hammers had been fired from earlier. I had wasted my shots on the old man. At this point, the man was beyond dead. His lifeless body laid open as the flesh glistened with wet blood. The creature filled its face with chunks of his body. Its expression was almost that of pleasure, blood spilling from its claws and mouth. I stood petrified. I stood in the presence of something that I didn't understand, but I knew that it was extremely dangerous. The speed and violence that this thing could produce was unlike anything I'd even heard of. I was so focused on the terrible sight before me that I didn't notice that the screams in the background had stopped. I took a step back, and the creature stopped its feast. It glanced at me slowly and turned to face me. I quivered. I was going to die in this basement. I was going to experience a terrible death, and no one would know why or how. The thing stood up but didn't move. It looked at me with satisfied eyes, as if it knew it didn't have to rush. I was a free meal, and it could take all the time it needed. I began to sob softly as I realized my fate, but a scream from the darkness caused us both to pause. It was the same terrible screams from earlier, except this time, it wasn't muffled, and it was much closer. Before the creature attacked me, a figure loomed behind it. It was much taller than anything I'd ever seen before, its head ducking down from the ceiling. Long strands of matted hair covered a good portion of its face as it approached. The screaming in the darkness had now stopped, as if it was now trying to hunt its prey. My eyes looked at the creature behind us. I was mystified at what I was seeing. The giant creature attacked the thing, mimicking my mother from behind, clawing and biting at it. Screams erupted in front of me as the two unknown creatures fought. Sam sprinted from the darkness and beckoned me to follow him up the stairs. I ran behind him, taking one last look at the horrific scene behind us. For a moment, amongst the carnage, I connected eyes with the much taller creature. They were red, much like an albino rat. Time seemed to slow as I began to feel hatred and anger fill my mind. Images of decayed bodies and rotten flesh began to flash. I felt an extreme hunger fill my soul and darkness take its place. The two creatures continued fighting, breaking our eye contact, and I continued up the stairs. I followed Sam out of the house, and we jumped in the car that was still running outside. We pulled out of there, the screams slowly muffling in the distance. We were both out of breath from crying so much as we drove back to the house. I could see Roger and my mother outside, arguing as we arrived. I tried my best to calmly explain what had happened, but it just came off as hysterical nonsense. My mom looked at me horrified, asking where I was and if I was hurt. I hadn't realized it, but I had a good bit of blood on me. I tried to reassure her that the blood wasn't mine, but that didn't reassure her. Sam wasn't in much better condition. He was crying, explaining to his dad that he let Grandpa out when we saw him at his house. Roger looked at me with a horrified expression. "We need to leave," he said sternly. My mother tried to talk to me more, but Roger forced her in the car and we left. Sam and I continued crying in the back as my mother asked us all what was going on. The rest of the night we tried to explain to my mom what had happened. She began crying as she realized that Sam and Roger had brought us to some weird cult compound. We told our story a half-dozen times. Sam was kind enough not to mention the old man that I shot. I also left out the part to Roger about what I saw when I made eye contact to that thing that Sam referred to as Grandpa. That would be the last time I would see Roger or Sam again. I wouldn't ever get any more answers about that night and what I saw. I wish I could talk to Sam and ask him what that thing was that mimicked my mother, but also the thing he called Grandpa. I still get those horrible flashes from time to time, mostly in my sleep, about the thing in the basement. Its red eyes are seared into my mind. I can feel its anger, its insatiable hunger. I fear that we made a connection, that I let it connect into my mind and knows where I am. I can't help but to think about where it is now and what it's doing. Something tells me though that I'll see it again, and that our meeting will be much more different from last time. I laid in bed, trying my best to let the sleep take me slowly into the dark realms of my subconscious, but my mind was too restless. This had to be one of the side effects of the new medicine, I thought. Normally I was out like a light. My morning routine mixed in with a high-energy career did a good job at leaving me drained by the end of the day. But as fate would have it, I was wide awake. The dull light of the moon seeped in from the edges of my curtain that blocked out most of the light from outside, but not all of it. Faint glows of electronics glimmered softly in the room. I readjusted in my bed, shifting positions and adjusting my blanket to find the right balance. I was beginning to get hungry, but I was hoping I could just fall asleep. I didn't need another snack. I tried my best not to look at the clock on my phone, but the temptation slowly burned hotter with each passing minute. I tried focusing on my breathing. I tried meditating, but I was never really good at it. A buzz emanated abruptly from the nightstand as my phone received a message. I knew better than to check it, but I was curious. Who in their right mind felt the need to reach out to me at such a late hour? It was probably spam. I found myself reaching over almost without thinking and grabbed my phone. The bright light of the screen stunned me briefly as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. The small notification window showed me a name and part of a text message which I couldn't make sense of. The name was familiar, but I didn't realize at first who it was. It wasn't until I clicked on the message and saw all the old text did I realize that it was my childhood pal Jeffrey who had just texted me. I shot up in bed as memories came flooding back. Jeffrey was one of those people that I would see every day, and once we went to college, it was as if he'd fell off the face of the earth. The new text was short and to the point, very much on brand for Jeffrey. The two words, "you awake," glowed with a sense of mystery behind them. For a few years, I feared that something had happened to Jeffrey, and I meant to reach out, but life has a way of slowly separating the ones you love most, if you let it. I responded immediately, as I feared that something really bad might have happened if I didn't. "Yeah, buddy, how are you?" I texted. He responded quickly, asking if I could meet him behind the old furniture store we used to work at that has long since gone out of business. "What is this all about? Are you okay?" I texted immediately. As quickly as I sent off the text, he replied, "I want to show you something." I agreed and got out of bed. I quickly threw on some clothes and plugged in the address to the store we used to work at across town. It was late. What little the city had to offer at this hour quickly dwindled as I headed downtown. The streetlights guided me softly against the night sky as my mind tried to process what was happening. If anyone else had texted me, I would have ignored it until the morning, but Jeffrey, he was different. He always had problems. I was just glad that he was still around and didn't want to risk missing out on what could be the last time to see him. I didn't realize how far of a drive it was to the furniture store until I was about halfway there. It had been years since I even thought about this place. The store was in my hometown, which I had visited maybe twice since high school. That was over a decade ago. Mainly because my parents had since moved since my brother's car accident while I was in college. Memories mixed with nostalgia had replaced my worry as familiar buildings and streets came into view. Some had since changed, while others had stayed the same. I drove by slowly, well below the speed limit, as I took in what this old well of memories had to offer. Before I knew it, I was at the furniture store and drove around back as requested by Jeffrey. Behind the now abandoned store parked a single car, as a shadowy figure sat on top of it. The parking lot lamps casted shadows every which way, making it difficult to see who it was. I aimed my headlights at the figure and parked a few feet away on the off chance that this wasn't my childhood friend. The man stood up as I parked the car, but stayed where he was. I got out and left my car running just in case, but I soon was able to make out that this was in fact my good friend. Jeffrey had a beard now. His hair was thinning and his eyes looked heavy. He smiled as I got closer. The alley behind the furniture store was fairly dark, but I couldn't help but notice an open door behind him, with a bright light spilling out into the alley. I greeted him like old friends do. Much like this old town, he had changed, but also had some things about him that were still very much the same. "Jeffrey, it's great to see you. You okay?" I asked, nervously. He nodded softly. "I've been better," he responded. A brief pause hung between us. "So, what did you want to show me?" I asked, nervously. I wasn't sure what he was about to say. I was worried he was on the last straw and was calling me for some help, but that wasn't it. He pointed to the door behind him at the abandoned furniture store. "This can take you back," he said. "What do you mean, take you back?" I asked. A different type of worry began to grow. "It can take you back to 2004. I've done it." I paused as I tried to figure out what was going on with Jeffrey. Was he on drugs, or was this some psychotic episode? "Yeah, buddy, I went down memory lane just driving in. So much has changed." He shook his head and spoke with unique clarity. "No, you don't understand. You can go back in time." He began to walk over to the door and motioned for me to follow. I hesitated and looked around on the off chance I was about to get jumped by my childhood friend. He stood at the entrance of the door and motioned for me to go in. I can't explain it, but something about spaces where people shouldn't go gives you access to the past. This is one of them that I found. I thought I'd show you since I know you'd be the only one to believe me. He looked at me with sad eyes, as if I was the only person on the planet that would understand him. I looked inside briefly and saw the fluorescent lights glow from the ceiling, bouncing off the tile floors. I smiled. Jeffrey was one of those that had always had crazy ideas. I guess you could call him a conspiracy theorist, but back then it wasn't like that. He was just one of those guys that thought outside of the box, that believed in Bigfoot and aliens. But as crazy as his ideas were, I never knew him to be a liar. I looked at him and smiled. Jeff, if you brought me back here at 1 in the morning to prank me, I will end you. You know that, right? I said, chuckling, while jabbing him playfully. Trent, I'm serious about this. This door will take you back to 2004. All things from that time will be there, as you remember them. But none of the people will be there. I think that's for the best, though. So you're saying that you found a portal back to 2004? I asked. He nodded. I found other ones too, but I thought you of all people would like this one. I'm sharing this with you as a friend. 2 rules though, if you decide to step through, is that always keep the doorway open, as it's your way back, and not to stay longer than an hour. They can find you if you stay too long. Of course, you can find other portals to get back, but that's harder than it sounds. I was able to do it, but I almost didn't make it back. My amusement slowly shifted to curiosity. What if Jeffrey was telling the truth? That portals back in time were not only real, but he found one that happened to take me back to my childhood. And what did he mean by, they can find you if you stay too long? I fixed my posture and took Jeffrey serious for a moment. Okay, buddy, I'll give it a shot, but only for a minute. He smiled and hugged me. I hope this helps you, but make sure you remember my 2 rules. Before I could say anything, Jeffrey turned and walked to his car and left. I watched as his taillights went around the building and off into the night, leaving me in the dark alley with my car still running and the open door to the abandoned furniture store. I shook my head as I walked back to my car. This is silly, I muttered to myself. I got back in my car and routed my phone back to my apartment, frustrated. Before I put my car in reverse, I paused. The glow of the door drew me in. I sighed. Just a peek, I thought. A quick peek to reassure my mind, and I'll be on my way back to the city. I hopped out of my car again, still leaving it running, and walking quickly over to the open door. I peeked inside and looked both ways, seeing a bare hallway. My anxiety grew as I stepped in, fearing that I was about to get jumped or killed or something. I opened an old wooden door to my left and looked inside. The old break room of the furniture store looked just as it did when I worked there so long ago. I looked down back the empty hallway and back inside. Old furniture filled the room, as well as old posters hanging on the wall. I even saw a schedule that had both Jeffrey's name and my name on it. I slowly examined the room as I made my way out of the showroom, and to my surprise, old furniture filled the once empty space. The furniture was out of style and dated, much like what I used to sell. I could hear music playing overhead that the store would play. The smell of the showroom hit my senses, flooding my mind with memories I had forgotten. I continued through the showroom and out the front door, seeing both sides of the street filled with cars from the early 2000s. The streets had all the stores I remembered as a teen, and they looked to be open. Some I had even forgotten. There was an old ice cream shop that my brother would take me after seeing a scary movie. There was the pizza place that I hadn't seen for at least a decade. The Blockbuster with the familiar posters of the new game releases, and the once empty rows that were now full of the DVDs and VHS tapes of that time. There was a Kmart down the distance with the distinct big red K glowing against the night sky. To my surprise, it had appeared for the most part that Jeffrey was correct. That old door had indeed sent me back to 2004, but sure enough, no one else was here. The air smelled how I remembered it so long ago. The lights of the streets outside guided me through the memories of the familiarity of my hometown as it once was. I stepped out into the street and walked over to the pizza place in awe of this new discovery. The town I had just driven through minutes before seemed to have been restored to its former glory. Out of sheer curiosity, I entered the pizza parlor and wondered if it would be possible to obtain the delicacy of the past. The smell of the restaurant unleashed more memories as I walked over to the buffet line. To my delight, trays of full pizzas lined the buffet. Soft music of the overhead radio played as I inspected the restaurant for any workers, or even other patrons, but it was clear I was all alone. You would think that going back to one of the best times in your life with no one to bother you would be a wish come true, but I felt uneasy with the idea that I was all alone. The feeling of loneliness didn't last long, as I tasted a slice of pepperoni pizza to find that it tasted even better than I remembered. I checked my watch, unsure of the time I had entered through that doorway, and estimated that I'd been here for about 5 to 10 minutes tops. I remembered Jeffrey's warning about staying past an hour, that something about "they will find you" softly echoed ominously in my head. I grabbed another slice before heading behind the counter to grab a box to put the pizza in. I had so much that I wanted to see and do. I loaded up a pizza before leaving the store and walking over to Blockbuster. Inside was empty, but again, music played overhead, and the video game display that housed the original Xbox and PS2 stood in the center of the store. 2 separate screens facing away from each other had loading screens for each different console, a temptation I couldn't resist. I checked the time again before stepping back out into the street and weighed my options. I had spent roughly 20 minutes here. I was debating if I had enough time to head back to my house before the hour was up here. There were a couple of things I was interested in seeing if I still had back at my parents' place. To my delight, I saw my old bicycle parked out front of the ice cream shop. I would have just enough time to glance around and make it back if I hurried. The bicycle was smaller than I remembered, but I was able to adjust the seat. I wanted to hurry back to my place quickly so I'd have more time here, but I was so memorized by all the old places I had forgotten. I rode back to my house feeling how it felt so many years ago. My worries of real life faded away, as this new realm was able to bring me back to a much simpler time. I finally reached my street, which welcomed me like a fresh memory. The homes looked just how I remembered them, the lights to which were all on and comforting. I slowly rode down the street, remembering the neighbors I had as all their cars were still out front, but again no soul was seen. The air outside didn't seem to have a breeze. The sounds of night were missing, as normally one would hear the distant chirps of crickets and nightlife. It was as if not only was I back in time, but time itself had stopped altogether. The nostalgia slowly began to fade as time went on and something sinister began to form. It was like the longer that I was here, the more I didn't belong. I stopped in the middle of the street and looked at my house. My parents' cars filled the driveway, just like I remembered, and my older brother's car was parked in his usual spot on the street. I glanced at the time and I needed to head back. That is, of course, if I was going to take Jeffrey's advice and only stay an hour. I'll just take a quick peek, I thought. When was I going to get this kind of opportunity like this again? If I was lucky, I'd still have my stuff here. All of my vintage games and Pokemon cards, which had to be worth something now. I rode up on the lawn and dumped my bike like I always did. I entered the front door and was greeted by my childhood home. A part of me wished that my family was still here, despite what all had happened, but I knew I was all alone. The home was slightly different than how I remembered, mostly slightly smaller and much quieter. I walked through my house and went to the basement where my brother and I's bedroom were so many years ago. My parents had renovated the basement, which acted like its own separate apartment for me and Steven, my older brother. I walked down the stairs, which creaked softly under the plush carpet. The memories had caused me to forget about the time as I reminisced in the basement. It was just how we left it. Old video game systems were plugged into our large body TV that my dad put down here when he upgraded the living room TV. Old video game posters hung on the wall, and the old fridge in the corner hummed softly as I inspected the basement. I wanted to go to my room and find all the forgotten treasures, but something unexpected happened. The lights in the basement went off. At first, I was caught off guard and pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight. The screen confirmed the time, and that I had indeed been there just over an hour. Before I could do anything, a distant sound rang muffled in the distance. A siren, much like one of a tornado siren, began to go off. I froze in place as I was unsure of what this meant, but deep down I knew it was bad. Was a storm coming? Out of instinct, I wanted to go to my room and lock the door, but I knew that I needed to get out of here and get back to the real world. I just hoped that I was still able to get back. I waited briefly until the siren stopped and went back upstairs. On the main level, the lights were still off, as well as the lights outside. Every part of this world seemed to be plunged into darkness. I searched the coat closet by the front door for a flashlight, since that's where we kept our odds and ends, when I heard a strange yet familiar sound. The house was old and creaked at certain points, but the sound that I heard came from above me on the second floor. A soft creak that slowly shifted from my parents' bedroom down the hall. I searched frantically before finding my dad's large mag light and shined it up the stairs. The empty stairway was unsettling in the unnatural light. The sounds had just stopped before exiting the hallway and entering my field of view. There was something on the other side of the wall waiting for me. I stood up while keeping my eyes on the stairs above me and slowly crept sideways to the front door. As I watched, an unsettling figure stuck their head out from behind the wall. A pale face peered out from the top corner of the wall and looked down at me. Whoever this was must have been very tall for them to angle their head downwards. I paused. I was unsure of what I was looking at. The flashlight's light had faded at that distance, making it very difficult to identify whatever it was I was looking at. The features of the face were slightly familiar, but they were so distorted that whatever this thing was wasn't something I wanted to meet. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than a few seconds. My eyes began to adjust to the distance and the poor lighting. It appeared that the decrepit face of my mother, smiling wide, began to process in my brain. It was clearly a grotesque imitation, as if someone was trying to trick me at a distance without fully concealing their true nature. Her eyes were black and reflected back the flashlight's light. Her teeth looked long and filled her wide smile. The mouth looked stained like a child had smeared a red popsicle all around with no concern. A hand slowly grasped the wall beneath her, revealing long, jagged fingers with pointed nails. The upstairs creaked again, and I took off out the front door. I closed the door from the outside and shined my light frantically for the discarded bike in the yard. Outside was an intense layer of darkness I'd never experienced before. All the other lights were off on the street. There were no guiding moonlight from above, just absolute darkness. I scanned the yard and finally found the bike and quickly mounted it. I could hear movement inside and the front door being opened as I tore off out of the front yard and down the street. I could hear screeching erupt from inside the house, which caused me to turn back to catch a glance at whatever that thing was, but it was too dark to see anything. I wasn't sure if I was being chased, but I pedaled my bike as if the devil himself was behind me. I tried to steady the light in front of me, but the intensity I was riding at made it nearly impossible with one hand. I tried to keep it steady, but I ended up dropping the heavy mag light behind me on the street, causing me to look back again. The light rolled sporadically, briefly shining on the tall, naked figure sprinting full speed in my direction. "Oh my gosh!" I cried, as I pedaled faster and harder while trying to catch my breath. It was one thing to imagine that something horrifying was following you, but it was another to actually see something unknown and confirm it. I was riding blind with this horrific creature running behind me. I couldn't tell if it was gaining, nor how far away I was from the doorway that would lead me back to my reality, but what I did know was that I couldn't stay here. I continued to pedal and guide myself with the faint memory I had of the town. A curb caught me by surprise and I tumbled hard off my bike. I somehow found myself getting up quickly and grabbing my phone to use as a flashlight. I had to be close to Main Street. A brief scan of the nearest building confirmed that I was just down the road from the furniture store. My only ticket out of here. I began sprinting down the street, feeling all the injuries I just acquired from my bike crash. My left hand began to throb, and both knees stung with a sharp pain as I heard the distant screams beginning to gain on me. My light bounced all around as I shined it on every building, looking for the one I used to work at so many years ago. I could now hear footsteps slap against the concrete behind me at an alarming rate. This thing was definitely going to get me. To my surprise, the furniture store finally came into view. A surge of energy flooded my system. Whatever was behind me was close, but now seeing where I was gave me that extra push to get me through the pain. I finally reached the glass door of the store and went inside. If this store was like the one from my teenage years, it would have a lock on the front door I could close from inside. This would buy me enough time to get to the back of the store and out of this twisted realm that seemed to mimic my childhood. I closed the doors quickly and felt the lock of the left door and twisted the bolt in place. Immediately, the front glass doors began to shake violently with a force that surprised me. I shined my light out the window and got a full glance at this thing. It was taller than I realized. Its face looked much different from earlier. It no longer looked like it was imitating my mother, but more alien and twisted. Its face held a demonic expression of hatred and anger. It continued to shake the door as I made my way through the store. The glass of the front door began to crack, but I knew I had enough time to make it to the back door. At the back of the store, I entered the break room and quickly made it to the door that brought me into this place. It was still open. I could see outside and saw my car was still running. I walked through the door and closed it, in fear of this thing making its way into my reality. A sense of relief washed over me, and for a good measure, I tried opening the door again, but it was now locked. I took a few breaths as I walked to my car and got in. I checked the time and saw that, although I had been in that strange realm for over an hour, it had only been 1 minute from when I last stepped through. I drove out to the front of the street and shined my headlights onto the store as I saw that it was now bare again, much like how it was when I had arrived. The old stores were back to being current franchises and the cars parked on the road were much more modern. My nerves and anxiety began to fade as it was clear that I was now back. I drove back home in silence, thinking about the last hour and what I had experienced. Jeffrey sharing his discovery with me had done more damage than it did good. It opened my mind to the strange nature of this reality and the dimensions that lay wait in the shadows just outside of it. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing that had followed me back to the gateway. I couldn't tell you how it knew not only where I was, but also how it knew to imitate my mother. My eyes had been opened to a truly awful reality, one I only thought existed in obscure concepts or video games. On the drive back, I found myself noticing some buildings looking abandoned or simply open, but no one inside. I wondered if one of those doors on any of those buildings would lead me back to the past, and I wouldn't know until I went through. I shuddered to think what would have happened had I made it back to the door to this reality and it had been closed, leaving me there to be killed by that thing. Another more horrifying realization came to mind as I parked my car. Would that thing would have been able to follow me had I not closed that door?